the criticisms of Christianity and the criticism of Islam, or maybe I should say, looking at these critically, right? What do we find? Not what. What do we find that we should expect to find, given the claims? What don't we find, and how does the evidence stack up without all the filler, with just what we have, in a way of writing that we can know what it said, through archaeology. Writing, I mean, both scripture and all the sources, and what, in particularly, of writing of what other people say. Now, with the rise of Christianity, we see writers freely admitting that there are other groups out there, that other churches, other Christian, they view them as heretical, but they said that, yeah, they're out there. I mean, from the works of Paul, one of the first letters, if not the first, Galatians, he's talking about these Judaizers. The works of John were written, whether you want to believe John the Presbyter was, or who John was, whether it was John the Presbyter, John the Apostle, some guy named John, somebody writing in the voice of John, but they're not pseudonymous, they're not misnamed, they're just, they don't really claim to be someone who they're not supposed to be. Like how Hebrews in the Middle Ages got Paul attached to it. Even from the grouping, we know it's not even the people that compiled the Bible as late as the format of the codex that we now have. That Hebrews gets grouped in with the Catholic epistles, between the Catholic epistles and Pauline epistles. Well, we see the Nero persecution of the Christians. We see them mentioned in Josephus. Now, one part of one section where the Christians get mentioned, we see where it's tampered with, and it's very obvious, and we can extract that out. Now, when people try to say all the references to Christianity were forged, no, they weren't. It's like coming across, it's like if you're reading something from Shakespeare, and then there's a sentence that doesn't fit, and it's, yo, what up, dog? I was gangbanging with my homies in South Central LA, and I shot a bunch of Crips. LA didn't exist, the Crips didn't exist, nobody talked like that. So you don't have to dismiss, all of King Lear or Twelfth Night. You can just say this didn't originally belong there. By the first century, we have works, strange works like Mark, Letters of Paul, pretty much all the stuff that we have in the New Testament. Maybe not Second Peter, possibly not Jude, but Jude does look something like the first century. And even when very skeptical scholars are looking at these, they can almost put them in groupings of dates, so of what would come after what. Second Peter had to be one of the latest things written because it's mentioning the works of Paul. This person already knows of Paul. By the second century, we get fierce debate among many groups of people, almost right down the line, starting in 105 with Ignatius of Antioch. And if you want to go earlier than that, you got Polycarp and Pius, which are straddling that, and you've got Clement, who's just inside the first century. But going into the second century, into the 100s, we've got massive amounts, and then more into the 200s. And then we've also got these secular sources writing about, or sources hostile to Christianity, saying, yeah, that's the story. And nobody says Jesus didn't exist. They just said he's a black magician, or he's this, or he's that, or the apostles stole the body. And we have a recognition of all these contending sources. We have people shouting down Marcion, combating the Valentinians. That's Irenaeus is going after the Valentinians. We see the strife between Docetists. We see people who come to be known as Orthodox writers, those within the Catholic movement, who get deemed heretics or who vehemently disagree with other people or defending groups. We have Irenaeus defending the court of Medicians. We see Origen kind of straddling the strange line, which is, we could see a trend coming out of Alexandria. We can see a trend coming out of Antioch for their different dispositions. We see Tertullian going with the Montanists all the way up to Nicaea, and then the turnover. We could see when things got hostile, when they didn't. And this was known about by the church. Now, modern day backwoods ignoramuses who were stuck in King James onlyism, they would claim, oh, the 27 books were put together by the last surviving apostle, and this is what we've had. And it's just lunacy. Nobody believes that. And then we have, starting in about the 16th century, the German schools being very, very thorough. And we see things like Q-source coming out of there up until the early 20th century, late 19th century, Wellhausen. So we've had a very rigorous study of Christianity and Judaism for at least 500 years. And even the early sources, they're even debating what should be in the canon. Should Hermas, should First Clement, should Second Peter, should Third John, should these works be let in? Should we even read the Apocalypse of John? What are we to make of Hebrews? What do we make of James? And we've got a lot of historical continuity. Now, the theological points, hotly debated. But of things we can go down and say, well, the early Christians weren't they weren't claiming Jesus was the King of the Jews. Well, why all four Gospels, which, if you're looking at them independently, not looking in a codice, you'd say, damn, that lines up. You would say Matthew is the antithesis of John, and the writer of Luke did not like Mark and had changed parts of it, and the writer of Matthew did not like parts of Mark and had to Judaize them. And it would be unlikely for a a disciple of Paul to read Matthew and think there was anything good in that, or at least the book was good. You had a lot of contention like this, and it's not hidden. It's right there in the pages. And we get the earliest scrap of the New Testament. What is it? Is it something like a piece of Mark or proto-Mark, if there is such a thing? Mark being pretty much a proto-gospel in itself. Is it some I don't want to use minuscule because that's the type of writing, but miniature piece of Pauline writing? No, it's John. It's the Gospel of John, dating from about 115 to 135. And that's not an autograph, that's a copy. And it lines up with the John that we have today. And it's the Ryland manuscript. And by 200 years later, you have codexes in other languages and these things. So the time that we know, there's a science behind the time it takes for a piece of writing to travel in any given period of technology. And it pretty much lines up that the dates for these are pretty solid. It's pretty much so many decades or a decade after this stuff, these events went down, and people putting their different spins on them, as everybody does. And people say, well, why wasn't Jesus known for raising the dead and all these miracles? It was normal back then. It's strange to say that, but people didn't think that odd. You went to your astrologer. You didn't watch the weatherman on TV. You went to your rainmaker. You didn't. Islam, what do we find? I mean, with Christianity, we can see the graffitis in these hidden places. We can see all these people talking about it. Islam, what do we see? for the first 90 years of the Islamic calendar, the Islamic Empire, what we know as the Islamic Empire, were going around acting like Byzantine Christians. Why is that? They were acting like Syrian iconoclasts of a mixed of adoptionist, Nestorian, Mandaean, Jewish, strange strain of almost a conglomerate with Zoroastrian and Buddhist hints. And they're acting like Romans. I mean, one of the first things we have is a receipt. Only Romans did that. When the army came and took something, they wrote out a receipt for them and said, "Oh, we took this many. Here, hold on to this." You know, basically, so another group doesn't come through and take some of your stuff, and if they do, they have to compensate you for it. We see CBOS gets tampered with, so that's hard to use, and that's one of the later sources that we have. That's coming, in 60 years after? I mean, we've really got a lot of writing talking about these Saracens or Hagarenes or Ishmaelites from an early time. In fact, you could say, well, it's in closer proximity, and there's a much more variety of writers than we do for early Christianity. What's the problem? With the consistency that we've been seeing the Christian enemies of early on, such as Tacitus and Pliny, people persecuting Christians, with early Islam, we see people who don't know that these people are Muslims, that they necessarily have a different religion. And some view them as, oh, they're us. There's a Nestorian writer up by Edessa that says, this is, they're friendly to the Nestorians. They like us, and, you know, we can thrive under here. We see them going into North Africa using Latin, using their Islamic sayings in Latin. And when you translate in Latin, these are almost the same sayings that the Christians use. In nomine Domini, in the name of the Lord, you know, all this strange writing. Why do we see this? They have crosses, they have icons of John the Baptist. In fact, even the later Islamic icons look like Ghassanid icons. And they're strangely Jewish, but they disagree with the Jews. And to the Christians, they look Jewish, and even to some Jews, they look Jewish. And when they talk of a prophet, the prophet is much later than this character, Muhammad, but even the title Muhammad ibn Abdullah just means the praised one, son of the servant of God, which is the same title the Syrian Christians have always used for Christians, or for Christ. Praised one, the anointed one, his name be praised, Christ, son of, who's the servant of God, Mary. That the early sources in early sources always refer to him as son of Joseph, just as his normal title, which is what his name would be walking down the street. But as a Christian title, it would be son of Mary. And even in the Quran itself, I mean, using critical methods, they very easily find a third of the Quran is an ancient original from Syriac Christianity. But even looking through the modern day Quran, we see Muhammad's name appear 3 to 4 times. It depends on how you want to look at Ahmed, which we were always told was the best name for him, or the most important. But the Persians, the Copts, the Nestorians, the Byzantines, the Vandals, the Franks, these are all independent sources that aren't colluding with each other, that are telling a similar story, and it does not line up. These people are pirates, they're coming through, they're not even attacking cities, and they're taking their cues from different bishops. Muslims taking cues from bishops, erecting crosses on things, using Greek and Latin. Something's amiss here, and why aren't more people screaming about this?